All right, which is good. We are Tazama. We just joined Linux back in December, so we're pretty new. We've been around for a while. My name's Greg McCormick. I'm the executive director. I had a stroke, so if I get stuck on a word like that, yell at me, and I'll gladly clarify it for you. All right. The first thing we get asked is, where'd that name come from? So it's Swahili, and it means to take a look, which is basically what we do. We look at the event stream for patterns, design patterns, and we figure out that it's fraud or not. That's the name change, and that's why. So who we are. We basically are open source software for fraud detection. We are transaction monitoring, but we are not the sanction screening side. We assume that you bring that. We can act on it, yes, but we are not that. We are funded by Bill and Melinda Gates. We are, from a governance standpoint, it's the Linux Foundation. Bill and Melinda Gates doesn't really do that. They would rather have the ideas than give away money. Leadership-wise, it's myself, Justus, and Rika. Rika is not here at the moment. She's down at another event. On the next slide, a little bit more about us. I'm not going to go into detail on this, but the bottom line is the people that are in charge have at least 20 years experience. I myself have 30. So we've been around a while and been doing this a while. So why are we doing this? Why did we even start? Kenya lost nearly 4.5% of its GDP to scams. All right, 4.5%, that's a big number. 25% of the global population is defrauded. Over $1 trillion is lost to scammers each year, right? And by the way, not very many people report, the fraud. And the reason is reputation. The reason is they assume it's hard or complicated. So only about 59% actually report. So it's not even a real number that we're talking about. The interesting thing that's happening right now is technology is advancing dramatically. So we can do a lot more with fraud than we have before. For example, we don't do too much with that at the moment, but it's coming. So the fraud advancements, the policy advancements, here in the UK, you've got that payback system for people that have been defrauded, et cetera. So everybody's evolving. We're working on this a lot more. Oops. And sorry, I can't see the build. So no one doubts the impact of fraud, right? It's huge. Everybody's aware that it exists. What took us here? We have the level 1 project principles, all right? This goes back a long time. This guides Gates towards being, directed in how to make an impact as far as what they do. They determined that they needed an instant payment system that was simple, easy, fair, and equitable. But then that left us, trusted, right? So when you've got people that make $1 a day, some of your customers make $1 a day, any loss is too much, all right? So it's very important to us, and that's what we're here for, is to put trust in the system so they'll actually use the system. Journey-wise, we started back in 2016, a long time ago. They had this idea. It took them about 3 years because they're very thorough. And they hired Deloitte in 2019 to basically come with the rules and typologies. Justus will talk a little bit more about that. They also came up with a way to classify the various types of fraud. So Deloitte was hired for that. Then in 2020, late 2020, we did POC with Cybrin and Lextego. Rob is here from Lextego, so one of your compatriots from up here. After the POC, we did MVP. From the MVP, we then went to beta testing. Beta testing involved JOPAC, which is the Jordanian clearinghouse, and it involved Banks of Africa. So pretty much all payments in South Africa in particular, but a lot of SADC as well. So we had a lot of real fraud to work with in that case. And from then we moved into Linux at the end of the year. Geographical focus. All right, we spend a lot of time in Africa right now. We're all about emerging markets. So we want to focus on them first and foremost. From Africa, we'll go to Asia, and then we'll go to Latin America. The Latin America is not on the Gates roadmap, but it's on ours. But one thing I want you to notice is North America is not listed, EU is not listed, UK is not listed. You know, we're about emerging economies. That doesn't mean we don't work in those environments. It means that, you know, we don't focus on trying to deliver. We don't really deliver anyway. We advise, and that's about it. So our mission is all about building trust. And we do that by stopping fraud in real time, and emphasis on real time. The average typology check is about 50 milliseconds, so quite fast, all right? And through that, we build trust in the system. So we want to stop the fraud before it occurs, before people actually lose money, all right? We have a variety of features for real-time, as mentioned, API-driven, rules-based, and configurable. Justus will talk more about this in a little bit. But we had a couple of goals. The first goal was engine only. This is something they're pretty big on, right? It doesn't work in real life. I can't go to you and say, you know, here's an engine. Because the first thing you say is exactly what Bank of Africa said, is how do I compare this to what's on the market that has an interface and has a way to build rules and things like that. So we quickly got out of that, and we're in the process of doing that right now. Rob's team is actually doing that part. But aside from that, the goals were to lower the barriers to entry. So let's make this open source and get rid of the cost immediately. In the emerging markets, we actually help. We do a lot of consulting as well. Not consulting, excuse me, advising. Make the deployments easy, right? Some products take, you know, literally months to do. You can deploy our solution in an hour, all right? Make it explainable to both staff and regulators. This is huge. The regulators right now, the AI is not regulated, so it's all the buzzword, but we're not doing that at the moment, all right? And the reason we're not is they can't see inside the box, right? If you take a look at their specs, it says things like, you know, be good to each other, you know, do no harm, that kind of thing. No one really has real specs right now. So it needs to be explainable both to staff and the regulator. Low cost to acquire and to operate. You know, how do we make this very affordable to do? We, for example, are Kubernetes-based and run in containers. And then we offer guidance. How do we deploy this? How do we make a program around it? How do we work with the regulators? How do you make sure the regulators are taken care of? And then the rules and topologies are in a standards body. So we have, it's called a joint development fund. We actually have a way to keep that private, even though that part is open source as well. You have to join that part of the organization, though. So what we learned along the way, the number one thing was make calibration easy. We had calibration, but it was manual. It was way too hard, right? So in this case, we are taking advantage of AI. And again, this is something that Rob's team is actually working on for us. So what that'll do is, after a little bit of listening and learning your environment, it will calibrate your environment for you. And then after that, we put it in maintenance mode, and it will continue to recalibrate your environment. That is all AI-based. The admin client, the rules and topology configuration is all been made visualized, or is being made visualized right now, and that is all Select Tego. The one thing we found out is, even though there are a lot of standards like ISO 20022, everybody does it differently. So of the initial people we talked to, every single one of them did differently. They have blended different, and they're going off to fax messages, etc. So what we care about is the flow. And that's something that we get into in another class a little bit more. We care about your financial flows, and we match the flows. And if we need to change the message, you know, if you're like 8583, if you're card-based, for example, right? You do a transform with a PPA adapter, a payment platform adapter. And so for those of you that just walked in, I've had a stroke. So if I say something that's not clear, you know, trust me, you're not going to make me, you know, feel bad about it. Just say something, okay? The other thing is case management is not investigations. There are a lot of open source case management systems. There are no open source investigation systems. You have to customize that yourself. Hopefully we'll be fixing that. We're looking at a big donation, and hopefully that'll solve that problem. But the biggest thing we learned was you got to have the UX, right? You guys just can't compare an engine to something with the UX. So we need to make a minimal part of that, and that's also part of that contribution. So what's underway? The calibration project, the admin and rule and topology and config, that's all Lextego. Supporting different message types or event streams, that's all Cybrin. Database changes and things like that. The goal is so even the event stream will be something that you can do visually. So bind to the system, pull back the data, and go from there. Features and release planning are myself, Justus, but mostly Justus, Sandy, and Scott, as far as getting things out the door. The TSC is up and running. It's not doing too much. We're still working through backlog from before, but we are getting there. And we've had a couple of working groups go through things. The JDF for standards body is up and running, but they haven't met yet. So Gates is still in control of all that. And you've got to get special permission to do anything. Our go-to-market framework is simple. We build a product, we don't market a product. We don't sell it, we don't do anything with it. The SIs do, or people do it themselves. If we look at the current marketplace in Africa where we're working, everybody's new, right? There's about 30 different countries at the moment. They're deploying different ways. BCEAO, which is Western Africa, is 8 countries. They're doing it all themselves. They have the very talent on the switch side, so they should do it themselves. COMISA has just awarded Lot 2, which is us, but, to Lextego again, say your name over and over. They're working on that. And that'll be 8 countries right off the gate, expanding it to 22. So really, this is just to show you that we don't do very much in that regard, right? The timeline is now, who the customers are. It's hub operators, regulators, fintechs, pretty much anybody. If you want to do your own event stream, you can do that. That's an advanced use case right now, but we're only doing payments. So, one of the number one questions we could ask all the time is, well, what about KYC? What about transaction money on sanction screening and things like that? You can add those in, but to us, they're an input. We don't really care where it got generated. And from there, I'm done, and you can actually get to the real thing, which would be Justus. So, all right.
We only have the one laptop. Thank you very much, Greg. Greg told you a little bit about our mission and our background. It is my privilege to share with you a little bit more about our product. I'm going to take you through a little bit of slides, and then I will actually show you a live demo. Very risky when you're away from home to do a live demo, but I've already tested it this morning and it is working, so I'm confident that it will be fine. Greg reviewed this slide in a little bit of detail earlier. I think we can go through this in a bit more detail now just to explain some of these features. In particular, most important to us is real time. You have to be able to block a fraud transaction before the fraud transaction completes, because otherwise the money will be gone. That money is almost immediately laundered through a network of participants, and you will never be able to reclaim the money. And at the moment, in some territories, regulators are actually forcing the banks to also recompensate the customers. So there is now a financial incentive also for the banks to prevent the transaction from settling if they suspect that there might be fraud. In our environment, speaking about particularly vulnerable people who only earn $1 a day, any kind of fraud loss is significant in those populations, and it makes the difference between whether or not people eat and whether or not they can feed their families. Stopping the transaction is incredibly important. In conjunction with that, our platform is API driven, so it provides a fraud detection as a service to an ecosystem. So if you're operating at a switch or if you're operating at a specific bank, you could integrate data feeds from other participants in your ecosystem as well, so that you can get a comprehensive picture and minimize the blind spot that financial institutions have about each other's data and behaviors that exist inside closed ecosystems. We are rules-based, which is a deliberate decision on our part in the modern day of artificial intelligence and machine learning. In particular, in our target environment, nascent economies with nascent technologies, AI and machine learning are not yet well established or well supported or well understood. So we focused on providing rules that are easy to explain for investigation teams, for the users themselves, and also for the regulators. And then finally, those rules themselves are configurable. So you don't need a developer to be able to maintain the rules and change their behaviors. It works through an external configuration file that is currently a JSON file. We are working on a user interface with Lextego so that we could actually do that configuration through a visual user interface rather than the 30 megabyte Excel document that I'm currently using. Our colleagues in the financial services industry are well versed in Excel, but not everybody is as good at it, so we'll be giving you a user interface to make that work a little bit easier. From a deployment perspective, Greg touched on this as well. So in your ecosystem, you have a switch or a hub operator or a clearinghouse, for example, and then that would be surrounded by a number of financial institutions that would participate in that ecosystem. So our code is freely available on GitHub. So anybody in that ecosystem can get the code and just deploy it for themselves. Fully DIY, and you can operate it yourself, manage your own alerts, and manage your own investigations. And you don't need to ask anybody else for help. What we typically see, though, is because of our environment, system integrators provide the technological support that people need to be able to do the implementations and also the maintenance and support around that, at least in the beginning, until they are familiar or capable of handling the system on their own. In a DIY operation or in a system integrator-led operation, you would still do your own alert investigations. It is still your responsibility as the entity, so the system integrator just helps you with the technical aspects. Beyond that, we also see a desire among some of the switches to be able to operate a fraud capability across their ecosystem. So in particular, this is where the API shines. A system integrator can request, as part of their scheme rules, all of their participants to submit their internal transaction flows as well as their inter-bank or switch flows to the switch so that those can then be evaluated as a complete ecosystem for a complete view. At the moment, in most ecosystems, the switch has a blind spot when it comes to fraud detection. They don't get to see the internal transactions of a bank or a mobile operator participant. They only get to see their own. So this model will allow them to get a complete picture of the entire ecosystem. And then finally, we do see a desire by people to operating the platform as a managed service. So you can run this both from an implementation perspective, integration perspective, and also handling your alerts and investigations on behalf of an entire ecosystem by yourself. And we even see some people here wanting to do that as a managed service for multi-tenancy with a number of different participants that are discrete in an ecosystem as well. So we are not the vendor. We provide the product, but we partner with system integrators or managed service operators or with the participants directly to be able to bring them the fraud detection capabilities they need. I'm going to skim this slide quickly, but this slide is just to show you where the integration points are. You would integrate through directly into our API in ISO 20022 format. Or if you did not have an ISO 20022 capability at present, you could use a payment platform adapter that would convert your messages into the ISO 20022 format that we could then ingest into the system for evaluation purposes. And then out the other end, once the evaluation has been complete and any alerts are generated, those alerts will go to your case management system or also directly back to your transacting system if any of those transactions need to be blocked. A little bit about the internal flow of the system. We have implemented what is called a RETI algorithm. So branching evaluations and then a reconvergence of the multiple parallel evaluation flows into a single result. Starting, maybe just walking through this as an example, if you are a bank, you would send through your transaction in ISO 20022 format, and we would then persist that into our database as history. We keep the transaction history and use that for all of our evaluations going forward for the same participants, because what we are looking at is the behavior of the participants. We look at the behavior of the debtor, we look at the behavior of the creditor, and we try and assess whether or not the transaction that is being performed right now is suspicious. So we look at all of the transaction history that have been received up to that point in conjunction with the incoming transaction for the evaluation. From the event director, we determine which rules and typologies are required. So a typology is basically just a scenario that is the sum of a number of rules that describes the behavior that we are seeing. Does it look like money laundering? Does this look like a scam? The rules themselves are then called by the event director that says only some rules are required for certain types of transaction. If you're making a merchant payment, that is a different set of rules. If you're making a transfer to somebody, that is a different set of rules. So the event director determines which rules to call. The rules all run in parallel, and then they send their result out to the typology processor to recombine them into a scenario that describes the behaviors that we are seeing. Immediately out of the typology processor, you have the ability to block the transaction at that point. So the system will evaluate a number of different typologies in parallel, but you don't have to wait for them all to be completed in order to block. The very first one that alerts or triggers its breach threshold for an alert will then immediately commission a block back to your client system. We have two levels of alerting. There is your typical blocking alert and then just an investigation alert. For money laundering purposes, very often a regulator would require you to keep on surveilling suspicious behavior rather than blocking it outright. So they want the money laundering behavior to continue. So you can have a soft alert that'll only alert for an investigation at the end of the process. Or in the case of fraud, you should probably block a transaction because you want to prevent losses for your customer. You would then have a hard block condition that comes out of the typology processor. At the end of the process here, we conclude the process with wrapping up all of the parallel flows back into one final result that would then generate that final outcome for you. Typologies. When we were working with Deloitte back in 2019, they came up with an initial list of 232 typologies in instant payments environment as part of work that was being done for our sister project, which is the Mojaloop Foundation. The Mojaloop Foundation themselves then extended that to 272 typologies to include internal types of fraud as well. When we looked at the data that we immediately had available out of a typical ISO 20022 message, without any of the PII that you might expect people to also look at, so no PII is being evaluated here except the date of birth of the debtor, we were able to define 33 rules, and then we summarized those 33 rules into 30 of the typologies that came out of that list. And we look at the money laundering behaviors, as I mentioned. Every scammer is eventually a money launderer. So when we look at the money laundering behavior, while we are not purely focused on money laundering detection, we use the money laundering behaviors to define the fraud. It helps us to identify when the creditor, as the scammer, is committing the fraud by looking at their past behavior for money laundering behaviors. And then the typology that we focused most of our time on was the authorized push payments fraud, which is an emerging fraud worldwide. Everybody is struggling with this at the moment. We invested a lot of our efforts into making that typology as complete as we can. And I'll walk you through a little bit of an example of how that works. I'm pretty sure everybody here has received a scam SMS or an offer from an ambassador or some sort of foreign dignitary or a general or somebody who says it's going to pay you a lot of money. You just please need to help him get this money out of the country, right? So that guy is not going to give you any money, but what he does do is he wants you to help him with little release fees, right? You need to pay for this, or there's a stamp duty that he needs to pay, or whatever the case may be. It's an administration fee. The scammers take all of that money and collect them from all of their victims into a network. And then immediately, as soon as that hits an account, that money is either paid out, or it is cashed out, or it is moved to a different account, or converted to different instruments of value, and moved around, and that money is gone, and you'll never see that money again. So when we look at this end-to-end flow, there are a number of different behaviors that we can evaluate as rules. The very first one, and it is probably the most pertinent rule, is whether or not you are making a payment to somebody new for the first time. that is such a high-risk transaction at the moment that some territories are even now considering just delaying even instant payments for up to 3 to 5 days to allow the risk to wash out. We're seeing that here in the UK, also Canada, and in Australia. The regulators are considering delaying those kinds of transactions. So that is a very, very high risk. But we can't rely on just that single item, because otherwise you're going to end up with a whole lot of false positives, because we pay new people all the time anyway. So we have to differentiate between paying somebody new legitimately and paying somebody new because it is somebody who is scamming you. So we look at other behaviors as well. On the side of the debtor or the creditor, we look at the debtor to say, is he behaving in a way that differs from how he usually behaves? Is he making more payments than usual? Is he making payments for higher amounts than usual? And then we look at the side of the creditor. In particular, we look at whether or not the creditor is behaving like a money launderer in their history or other scam behaviors. Are they collecting money from a large number of different people at the same time in a very short period? Are the amounts that they are collecting from people very much the same? So there are often reporting thresholds that exist inside an organization, and the scammers have to fly underneath that threshold to avoid the detection, but they also want to maximize their profits. So the window in which they can fluctuate their amounts is very narrow. So we look at whether or not those amounts are very similar in the transactions. And then we look at classical money laundering behaviors, mirroring, where somebody pays money into an account and then immediately moves the money into another account. Or they may group up a number of transactions over a short period. If it's a high volume scam, every hour money gets moved out of that account into a new account. And sometimes it's even commissioned. So they would rent an account from somebody called an account mule, and that person gets to retain 10% of all of the transactions that they handle. So we even look for the aggregated mirroring and commissioned behavior here. And then across the ecosystem, if you're operating this as a switch and you have the ability to do that, if you can see somebody who has multiple accounts with multiple service providers across the ecosystem, that is often also a red flag behavior. Okay. And then we look at this, we turn this into rules in our system, and then we do an evaluation of the sum of those rules against some thresholds. And if that transaction breaches the thresholds that we have put in place, that we have calibrated for the specific environment, then we would say, block this transaction. This transaction appears to be fraud. Let me show you a demo now. So I'm just going to duplicate my screen. All right, so as we mentioned, we are an engine. So we don't really have our own fancy front end yet. Postman is our fancy front end. So if you are familiar with Postman, Postman is an API simulator that helps us to drive our API and show you how the API works. So in this particular example, we're going to do a very quick and simple detection. We're going to detect a duplicate payment, which happens more often than you think. So somebody is double tapping your credit card or your mobile account. So if we look at the first transaction, I'm going to generate my message pair in memory here, and then we're going to send them in as a pair. So there's a PAC 008 message going in, which is our request to make a transfer, and then the confirmation of that message that comes back that it is successful. And then we're going to look at the result. So at this point, we know nothing about the debtor. We know nothing about the creditor. It's a first-time payment between two new people in our ecosystem. We have no information that we can use to deem the transaction suspicious. If we look at this, then we will say the transaction is not alerted. So we cannot raise any suspicion about this first-time transaction. And I have to be quick. I'll take you through what the results mean, but there's also a timer involved because it's real time. Our second transaction has to be within a specific window as well to flag very high risk. So I want to make that window work. So I'm going to send through my second transaction pair between the same two people. And that second transaction should now give us a little bit more information about whether or not the transaction is suspicious. So here we have the same two people involved, the same amount of the transaction, and now we see that it has alerted. So I'll walk you through the difference between these two. When we output information from the system, we deliver a very comprehensive JSON result. And I'll show you what that file looks like. So we keep the transaction itself is registered in the output so that an investigator can immediately see what the information was that this transaction was alerted on. And we also keep, for audit and replayability purposes, the network map that defined the routing of that original transaction. Which rules and which typologies did we actually use to do the evaluation? So this is the network map here. And then there is a comprehensive report that defines the output for every single one of the rules and typologies in that evaluation scope. And the one that we are looking for here is typology 95. We use the numbers so that we don't give away the secret source, especially if criminals are watching this video. You can't tell what we are doing. So this is our typology here, and it has a number of different rules that we are evaluating. There is a rule here to check whether or not you're paying the same person. There is a rule here to check whether or not the creditor is doing mirroring in their past behavior. So are they making those onward payments to somebody else? We are looking at whether or not the description of the payment is the same or close to the same. And we also look at the amount, whether or not two amounts, consecutive amounts, are similar within a level of tolerance that you set in your configuration. So it's not an exact match, it is a near match, because you don't necessarily want to do an exact match when it comes to numbers or even the descriptions. So when we look through these, you'll see all of them weighted as 0, because this is our first transaction and we don't have any previous history that we can rely on. If we then look at the second one, we'll expect to see a slightly different result, because this one did alert. So let me find that's the network map. There we go. So here you'll see we now have a result of 600, where our previous result was 0. So we have a vastly inflated score compared to our first transaction. And here you will see still there is no mirroring behavior. So this is still weighted as 0. But here we are making a payment to the same person. Here we have made a payment to the same person within a minute. If we had made that payment between 1 and 5 minutes, then this would have been a slightly lower score. And if we had made that duplicate payment after 5 minutes, then it may be a little bit less likely that it was a duplicate or an illegitimate duplicate transaction. It may have been a legitimate one. And you can, again, set these ranges in the configuration. And then the amount was also a match, but we didn't have a match on the description, and we didn't have a match on the mirroring, again, the commissioned mirroring. And then the sum of these amounted to a score of 600, and our configurable threshold for this typology says that if we had only breached 400, we would have only alerted for investigation. It's suspicious, but not suspicious enough to block. If we had alerted now, as you can see, our interdiction threshold there is 500. Our score was 600, so we had breached the interdiction threshold. So the system would recommend that that transaction, that second transaction, should be blocked because it is a duplicate transaction. And that is our demo. And then just finally a little bit about our roadmap. So we are going to be launching version 2.0.0 of the system at the end of this month. We have quite a lot of features that are going in there, a little bit of housekeeping. Since we joined the Linux Foundation in December, we have learned a lot about running an open source project as a Linux project. There's a lot of work that we needed to do and some housekeeping to clean up a few things. We'll be launching our system at the end of June. And then we'll be moving on with some of our more progressive features, so things that our customers have asked us for, things that are coming up in implementations that are currently being planned. So these are things that we are going to be working on over the next 2 quarters. Largely, I think Greg called some of those out already, but the configuration user interface and the rules builder, those are things that are also important for us to be able to assist our customers with the management of the system. And then also there's a case management and investigation user interface that we are currently negotiating a donation of code for that will help accelerate our ability to provide those functions as well. I'm not going to go through the rest of them. But this is also part of the minutes of our technical steering committee meeting. So if you wanted to see these, you can watch that video or look at the minutes themselves as well. But thank you very much. And I think that is the end of our presentation. How did we do on time? Great. Does anybody have any questions? Anything that I could give you a little bit more detail on?
Going to say one thing you didn't mention was how fast can it go, and then just volume and
Yeah.
speeds.
1.5 transactions a second is how far we test.
Yeah.
It's expensive in Africa. Here's nothing. It's, so it's
And turnaround time, 50 milliseconds, so that you can interrupt a transaction without impeding your customer experience. Thank you, Rob. Hello.
How easy is it to test like new rules that you add to the engine? Is there like support in the tool itself to do some like extensive integration testing?
For the techies in the room, I can show you here. So what we did in Postman is we actually found it very hard to create like transaction packs because you had to create those by hand. So what we ended up building was a sort of a, let's call it a library of functions that we can reuse inside Postman that'll allow us to generate those ISO 20022 messages at any point in time, even in batches. So for example, if I'm testing the function that we use to check if the amounts are fake, I need to generate 50 transactions in my transaction pack. I can do that now with a single statement that says, please give me 50 transactions starting from this date and then moving forward. One of the early learnings that we had in the system is a real-time system is very difficult to test in real time because you need to test the things as they happen. So our rules are currently, I don't want to call them pseudo real-time because they actually function in real time when they're supposed to, but you evaluate any transaction coming in at the time that the transaction was received, no matter when that was. So if I re-ingest all of my test transactions, even if they were all time-stamped a week ago, the system would still consider them as if they are coming in real time now. So that helps us a lot with the testing. It helps us that we don't have to artificially move forward the time window every time that we needed to do our testing. We test at now all the time. And we generate all of our test data accordingly out of this library. Thanks for that question, by the way.
Yeah, I want to know the calibration that was mentioned, part of the roadmap. How
Yeah.
frequent is that really required in your experience? Meaning, is some periodic thing that is done, is something which is out-calibrated over time based on the transactions you're collecting? How does that?
So the consulting answer is, it depends. What it does depend on is you will have dashboards that you are operating to track certain metrics in the performance of the system. So that performance would be how are your false positives and your true detection rates trending. And if you see any thresholds in those reports being breached according to your internal metrics or your expectations, then you would recalibrate. In theory, you could, if it was automated, you could recalibrate all the time. So based on what the trends are doing, keep on ingesting the data, keep on evaluating the data. The challenge that you have in any fraud system is that you can only really calibrate on your understanding of actual fraud. So you need people to report the fraud to you, to tell you where the fraud is so that you know what to look for, because the system isn't going to find fraud that it doesn't know about. It is going to find fraud according to the rules and the parameters that you have set up because your customers have told you where the fraud is. And you use that information as part of the calibration process. Similar to how artificial intelligence would do it as a supervised learning experience, you need the tagged data in order to do the calibration. So that feedback loop is essential as a part of the process.
What are you using history? So you've now flagged a transaction between those two individuals as being fraud. If there was another transaction that came into one of those individuals before it's been cleared down by the content, by the case management system, etc., does that weigh into your evaluation that this will be good multiple like this? You're not just looking at transaction, you're looking at
So what will eventually happen is this creditor will start collecting transactions from a large number of different people, and that in itself will trigger a different rule when it breaches its internal thresholds, and that will roll up to some other typologies. So this typology here that I showed you doesn't have a rule to say, is this creditor receiving transactions from a large number of different people? We're focused very much on identifying the duplicate transaction. But there are other typologies that will say that particular rule is eventually going to breach its threshold because of the collective history for that creditor in the ecosystem over time. Alrighty, how are we for time? Do we? Yeah, slightly over. I wonder how View is doing. Thank you very much for walking past the very busy View room to attend our demonstration here at the Tazama. Appreciate your time, and thank you very much.